Folks, today we are really honored to have Professor Winston Langley as the 2016 Martin Luther King guest speaker. Professor Langley is the Provost and the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he has taught political science and international relations since 1982. Professor Langley holds a bachelor's degree in biology, a Master of Arts in European Diplomatic History, a Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science, and a Doctor of Laws. His scholarly interests include human rights, alternative models of world order, religion, and politics. Among his many award-winning works, Dr. Langley is the author of Kasi Nasrul Islam, The Voice and Poetry and the Struggle of Human Wholeness. Professor Langley is considered to be the first Western scholar to study Nasrul Islam, who is the national poet of Bangladesh. Considering that Islamic affairs are such a burning topic in today's political discourse, and that Nasrul Islam was a Muslim who spoke powerfully against fascism, oppression, discrimination, and religious fanaticism, we've asked Professor Langley to enlighten us about the poet's contributions in the context of Martin Luther King's legacy. This is an intellectual challenge that only a scholar of Dr. Langley's stature could handle. We're very much looking forward to your presentation, Professor, and on behalf of the entire medical campus, I would like to extend you a warm welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Taker. Dean Karin Atman, leaders of the School of Medicine and the associated institutions this afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here. I think it's particularly significant for me because today I learned quite a bit about this building itself, that it has its roots in a past which sought to include all human beings. And that is part of my topic today. Martin Luther King was born in 1929 and died in 1968 and became a major civil rights and moral leader within the United States and beyond. Kasi Nasrul Islam was born in India in 1899 and died in 1976. Crippled from the 1940s, and actually never gained his consciousness until his death in 1976. Like King, he was a moral leader opposing oppression and discrimination. Like King, he was jailed for his efforts. Like King, he had learned to know how not to respect the empire of force in the pursuit of moral commitments. King was a Christian, a minister, a social and political activist, Nobel laureate. Nasrul, a Muslim, a poet. He wrote over 2,500 poems, over 4,000 songs. An activist, and is now the national poet of Bangladesh. In his novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, D.H. Lawrence had Sir Clifford Chatterley identify two groups of people in modern life. Those who have an appetite for flattery, adulation, stroking, much like many of our artists and sports figures, and movie stars, political leaders, even professors. The other, he claimed, are those who have an appetite for the meat and bones of things, who are everyday workers, those who are not often seen, are suspicious of flattery, earn their wage or income doing hard work. He found no particular sympathy for this second group. Lawrence was not unique in dividing human beings into certain groupings. The Hindus divided human beings into 5 social groups, at the top of which is the Brahmin. The Greek Plato offered 3 groupings, led by what he called the philosophy king type. The Marxist allowed for 2, possibly 3, with the industrial proletariat occupying a special place. And toward the end of the 20th century, we had claims about the end of history, with 2 groups remaining, a dying type and an emerging type, the latter resulting from what we've come to call liberal democracy. Then we have bodies of thinkers on race, who have divided humans into 3 or 4 groups, with one of these groups said to be inherently superior, others constituted by varying degrees of inferiority. Gender, which has been with us the longest, has posited 2 supposedly distinct groups. And religion, each of which recognizes its communicant as having some special place, often has found some not so special places for others. Then we have civilizations, 7 or even 8 identified in the 1990s, which are said to be the likely basis for dominant future patterns of human interaction. One seen as being in the ascendant because of its claimed higher levels of values is likely to define our collective future. There is an underlying unity to all the just mentioned supposed divisions among human beings. The unity bears on the view that you and I, that human beings, are capable of creating and sustaining some quasi-ideal social order or cultural order. And that while all human beings might in varying degrees be able to make some contribution to that order, there are historical types or groups which must lead the way. For Plato, it was the philosophy king. For Marx, it was the industrial proletariat. For the Hindu, it's the Brahmin. For the racialist, the presumed superior race or subgroup within the race. For religions, the believer, however consecrated, who best embodies the sentimental ideal. And for the civilizationist, the cultural formation that is seen as warming the supposed values of our defined future. Among the divisions of human beings is that which is based and has been for the last 400 years at least on what we have come to call the nation state, as distinct from the empire state or what has come to be called the city state. The nation state is considered an ideal. These divisions have ostensibly defined humanity, are not or have not been mere descriptions. They have become, and in every instance has remained, subjective embodiments. People have developed identities based on them. So one is a national, or passport, of course, and one becomes a nationalist, espousing, sometimes almost unconsciously, the idea of nation and nationalism. We are also been sexist, racialist, Marxist, civilizationalist, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Confucians. Nazrul and King, if one were to take nationalism as an example, were inclusionists because they transcended and sought to teach us how to transcend the political boundaries of their time and their place and the identities they espoused. First, they could not accept, as nationalists have claimed, that the world is naturally divided into nations, although they accepted and espoused the idea of a people, of nations, by virtue of historical, cultural, and other unique experiences. Secondly, they did not share the view that one's highest loyalty is to the nation. Thirdly, they rejected the view that differences that people encounter in the historical experiences make them fundamentally unlike. They rejected the notion that national unity of one state should be effected or maintained by the supposed extent to which nationals of one state are made to feel unlike those of others. This practice to them seeds distrust and even dislike of the so-called foreigner. Fourth, they rejected the exclusivist policy of egoism that is traditionally linked to what we have come to call national interests. All the groups previously mentioned, and in particular the nation-states, this claimed unit or basic unit of international life, partake of a central feature: exclusion. Exclusion in geographies, in religions, in income, in wealth, in preferences, in belief, moral and cultural sentiments. And these exclusions are at least responsible for the socio-economic systems which during the last 2 years alone offer one of the amplest examples of the world as a house of mourning, one riddled with sorrow and with pain. The Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the cries from South Sudan, the refugee migrant crisis throughout the Mediterranean area, Europe and the United States, the ruins of Gaza after a brutal and inconclusive war, the ruining of Syria through a vicious civil conflict, aided and abetted by many external parties, the rampage of Boko Haram in West Africa, the defiling trafficking of humans across borders, the abuse of the Rohingya minority in Myanmar, the outrages of ISIS, the massacres in Charleston and in Paris, the moral and social betrayals in the Greek financial crisis, the mistreatment due to the broad anti-Muslim postures that have been developed in much of the West. It must be understood that even if we were fortunate enough to have what is conventionally called a settlement of these crises, the pain, the trauma, the buried or hidden memories, too compartmentalized to ensure evidence of their psychological survival, will someday return to haunt us. The pattern of exclusion are so deeply etched culturally that we confine our moral compass to our convenient homeland, whether the markers of the boundaries are race, social origin, language, nationality, or religion, and we give primary loyalty to this homeland. Qazi Nasrul Islam and Martin Luther King argued and sought to persuade us that we're unlikely to solve the many problems we face, or those that are unlikely to develop, unless we rid ourselves of the exclusivist categories that have come to define us. And I purposely emphasize the nation-state since it is so intimately linked to us and so broadly defining of how we think of ourselves and our possibilities. It is also the case that both of these two moral leaders considered themselves nationalists. They accepted the idea of the nation-state, with the exceptions earlier mentioned. What they contend is that we have several overlapping identities, which should be allowed expression so that we can become more inclusive, given who we are and seek to become as human beings. For King and for Nazrul, we simultaneously belong to the family, to the town, to the city, to the nation, to the world, as well as to nature itself. In the case of King, and here I will simply quote from a 1954 sermon delivered in Detroit and his letter from Birmingham jail. He said, "We are part of a moral universe which has its moral laws not unlike the physical laws we confront. So the exclusive borders to which we earlier referred should not define us. Indeed, the interrelatedness of communities and states is a consistent feature of his moral and socio-political positions. And in the latter part of his life, using Vietnam as an example, he sought to emulate the Apostle Paul, who he saw as having left his, Paul, little village in Tarsus, and carried the gospel to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world. In the case of Nazrul, faced with broad pushes to identify with communal cleavages in India, in Bengal in particular, in an address given in Calcutta on December the 15th, 1929, he described himself as one that would never be a torchbearer for any individual group or party. It is not, and here I'm quoting him in the speech, it is not at all a fact that because I happen to be born in this particular country, that I belong to this country alone, and to this society in particular. I belong to all lands of the world, to all human beings of this earth. To each of these two thinkers and activists, questioners and violators of norms, seekers of a different model of social and political order, belonging to a particular identity or group, or having exclusive loyalty to one group only, invariably means or is associated with exclusion of others. It has been, since the time immemorial, the basis for communalism, religious intolerance, intergroup violence, mass murders, genocidal conflict. These loyalties are the ones which reject immigrants, even if all or almost all of us are immigrants to this continent and country, that invades against international students. US tax dollars should not be spent educating Afghans, Chinese, Iranians, and Turkish students, it is said, because they may become our enemies in the future, despite the fact that international students are often recruited to balance university budgets to the tune of some $25 billion last year. There are those who say, to untouchables in South Asia, we will always have the poor with us, while others luxuriate in riches, that seek profits from drugs for shareholders, with little or no regard for the sick person who must pay, that would create a trans-Pacific trade area which excludes the most powerful country in the Pacific, or seek to build the Silk Road economic zone that excludes the United States, that says to women, black or Muslim men, you are other. For Nazrul and King, the multiple identities we mentioned earlier are fiercely held, and linked they are to what Eric Fromm has called character-rooted passions. They are not artificial overlays. So, they can be used to excite our actions, just as in the case of partial or exclusive identities. These passions are, in turn, linked to our universal need for orientation, effectiveness, relatedness, rootedness, and unity, among others. We have a personal identity, our name, our physical appearance, our blood chemistry, our fingerprint. A social identity of many, depending on the groups with which one is associated and interacts. A national identity, of which we are often very proud and boastful, and grounded on markers that we previously touched on. We may not know others who belong to the nation. You and I may not know someone in California. But we construct, or we have constructed for us, mental images of who we and they are, and who we and they are not. Part of the problem of President Obama, I will contend, is that people do not have a mental image of him as an American. We have a global and cosmic identity also. We respond to the beckonings of the stars, to the smile of flowers, to the sparkle of dewdrops, to the hush of the quiet woods, to the texture and rhythm of color, to the play of electrons, to the elegance of calculus, to the sweetness of the fruit. All solicit our senses and intimate that we belong together as one. Every living cell seeks a larger connection. In Nazrul's poetry, despite what may be considered turbulences at times, the sea is in love with the moon. Our global identity is actually consistent with the idea of the moral universe, and therefore with the global responsibilities we have. And our multiple overlapping identities associated with what Nazrul calls our infinite self and linked to all human beings as they are, in King's words, children of God, and prepares what he considers a joint and constant effort to create special communities to which we jointly may belong. This brings me to the task of the partial reconciliation of the psychologies of multiple belongings, with which these two thinkers wrestled. Since some of the earliest times, and one has but to canvass Akhenaten or the Gita or Plato in the West, for instance, we have had debates about the breadth of individual capacity for moral empathy, for deep, passionate connection, not some broad, abstract claim of moral responsibility. Can that empathy, that sympathy, get beyond the city? That was the idea of the city-state. It could not be larger than our sympathies. Or the town where each person can actually know each other. Can a Bostonian Christian be passionately engaged on behalf of a Muslim in Jakarta, as she could a Christian from the South End? This, to political scientists, is of utmost importance when we speak of social contract or common security among human beings. The reconciliation lies in our human identity. This identity, contrary to what we have been taught, is at once the most basic and the most intimate. I repeat, that our human identity is at once the most basic and the most intimate. Mothers are anxious about their children, wherever mothers are. Each person has a need to make a dent, to have an impact, to be effective, whatever the activity she or he engages in. Each also has the need to establish deep ties with the past, what we've called history and memory. in its many, many forms, and it's called rootedness. Each has a need to form interactive relationships with others, some of the deepest spiritual and emotional levels, what we call relatedness. And each has a need to have a map, a form of inner consciousness of the social, physical, ideological universe, what is called a frame of reference or orientation. They also need a sense of oneness, of coherence, internally, with others, and with nature. These central or characteristic needs and their associated passions are part of our human, and many would say, species identity. And we spend much of our lives, sometimes unknowingly, searching and fighting for its primacy. Groups take turn from a tender age for each of us, trying to persuade us that we are first Langleys, Americans, Muslims, black, middle class, liberals, rightists, leftists, medical professionals, terrorists, women, peasants, socialists, students, professors, Arabs, Jews, among others, before we are human. King and Nazrul argued the obverse. Politics under this persuading gradually becomes, to quote King, a Darwinian universe in which the survival of the slickest leads to some numerical majority or some self-chosen claims of legitimacy to be indifferent, to ignore, to disdain, to degrade, to humiliate, to enslave, to torture, to kill, to engage in genocide, and to pursue the systematic assault on our environment. All these actions in the purported interest of the group or groups with which we identify, we hold dear, we care for, we love. The pursuit of the interest of the people in the groups for which we care, to the disadvantage of other groups for which others care, overlooks something King told us, that injustice and other wrongs anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And Nazrul, in his poem, Coolies and Laborers, instructed us that if one human being is humiliated, let it be considered the humiliation of the whole of humanity. This is the Nazrul who is not caught up in the web of preferential relationship, who is not so much rebelling against specific expressions of oppression, although he rebelled against Britain and widespread injustices, but the person who is rebelling against human degradation and injustice in all expressions. He could not understand why human, sacred humans, now the human identity, once dressed up or down with the name of prostitute, and these are his categories now, peasants, laborers, beggars, women, coolie, Muslim, Jews, communist, Buddhist, Parsi, Jain, Hindu, or Confucian, should be less morally noble and deserving. It cannot be immoral to kill our neighbor across the street, but moral to kill our neighbor across the ocean. It cannot be moral to possess guns intended to maim those with whom we interact in everyday encounters, or while one sleeps or prays, but moral to build and possess weapons intended to destroy cities, towns, nations. It cannot be immoral to poison my milk but moral to poison the rivers and lakes and oceans and farmlands and other expressions that make milk and the sustenance of life possible. Likewise, it cannot be moral to sell products known to be harmful to consumers in the south end of Boston, but moral to sell them in Sao Paulo or San Juan, Lagos, Calcutta, or Moscow. It is not a matter of geography. It is a matter of humanity. It is instructive, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt, to see that in the recent refugee crisis, many people, stripped of everything except their humanity, and remember World War II, are now being rejected by those who have appointed themselves as defenders of human rights. In coming to the end of my remarks, allow me to make 2 points. That above and beyond pointing to the worship of the group to which we belong, to the exclusion of others, and suggesting how we might go about using our multiple overlapping identities to help resolve those exclusions, there are 2 others about which King and Nasrul are concerned: the essence of culture and the development of humans beyond our current standing. In other words, they were both committed to the compelling need to support opportunities for those among us who are the least socially favored because of ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, language, disability, etc. And particularly for the US, which is becoming even more diverse, with the existing majorities slated soon to become minorities. It is crucial here. But in their view, such remedies often touch on the symptoms, a job, a position, rather than the real causes of the problems we face, which are deeply moral and spiritual and must be dealt with in terms of our own moral constitution. Sir Clifford Chateley, with which we began, lost his wife because he did not understand that the categories he had created to nurture his own comfort disguised the fact that his life was implicated in the lives of others. Beware of the sweetness of life. What we need to do, according to King and Nasrul, is nothing less than the reconstruction of ourselves and the reconstruction of the national and the global order in which we find ourselves. The latter I cannot go into today, although I might take a few questions in it. The former, that is reconstruction of self, begins with the rejection of and the scorn for the miserable aims, they call it, not the individual, but the miserable aims which begin and end with self. The narrow individual self, or any of the groups we have just gone through today. This type of beginning and ending undermines, in the words of King, the soul of culture, part of which we see starkly manifested in our political partisanship in Washington and elsewhere. Not only does it have that undermining effect, in general, it reverberates to the individual, he said. In the case of Nasrul, it renders us unable to experience the pain of the world as our own, to discover the joy of sacrifice, and to expand our souls to attain what he calls a nobler quality. And finally, to see and encounter humans as constituting a single moral community. Another enabling step is to accept as an article of faith, the majestic Article 2, Section 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recites that everyone, every human being, is entitled to all the rights and freedoms contained in the Declaration, to food, to education, to health care, to speech, to thought and religion, to life, security of person, against arbitrary arrest and detention, inhuman or degrading treatment, and to seek, receive, and impart information regardless of frontiers. Yes, everyone without distinction of any kind. And here are its categories, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, and the great elasticity or other status, This type of acceptance for Nazrul, although he was crippled by the time of the adoption of the Declaration, we are capable of because we have something in us. In the West, we use the soul. Nazrul liked to use the heart. Our heart, which to him is a universal temple. The heart is a Jerusalem, a Medina, a Kaaba, a mosque, a temple, a church. Here sat Jesus and Moses and joined the light of the truth. In the field of battle and the holder of the eternal sang the divine Gita, Bhagavad Gita. Retiring into the sanctum sanctorium of his heart, Sakyamuni, Buddha, still heard the cry of humanity and relinquished his throne and his kingdom. One must take risks, Nazrul said. In the cave of Arabia sat its darling in meditation, and he heard the call and preached the message of equality. I have heard no untruth, brother, sister. There is no temple, no Kaaba greater than the human heart. This symbol of devotion to something afar and at home is a statement that suggests that we have an unfinished temple to which we must attend. In the reconstruction of self, we must deal with the work of pursuing our own completion. Completion not in the sense of something finished or a perfection, but in creating a more comprehensive condition of being. It is through our species identity, or human identity, that we can truly be inclusive. I will end with the poem of a Greek, a gay man, a contemporary of Nazrul, less so of Dr. King, but espouses the very points we have just made, phrasing it differently. It is entitled Walls. Without consideration, without pity, without shame, they have built great and high walls around me. And now I sit here in despair. I think of nothing else. This fate gnaws at my mind. For I have many things to do outside. Why did I not pay attention when they were building the walls? I never heard the noise or the sound of the builders. Imperceptibly, they shut me out from the outside world. The walls are those of all the groupings we have mentioned: gender, class, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, immigrant status, nationality, disability, property. King and Nashville wanted us to break down these walls because we have many things to do outside, including the expansion, enrichment, and the completion of our condition of being. Thank you.